Shuttleworth hosts some of the most magical air shows in the world for fans of vintage aviation. The 2024 Family Airshow included plenty of Shuttleworth favourites, plus one-off formations and top-notch visiting displays. There is nowhere quite like Shuttleworth. To those who love the very earliest flying machines, vintage biplanes from the 1920s, First World War fighters and some that are even older than that, then this place is hallowed ground. It is Mecca. There were 7 Shuttleworth airshows on the calendar in 2024, but this one, the Family Airshow, hosted a more varied lineup than most. Let's take a look at what's coming up. We start with a quartet of fighters, then the other ex-military aircraft from the Shuttleworth collection, including those from the 2 World Wars. Then the family theme takes over with barnstorming and formation aerobatics. The Lancaster comes next, and then a racing theme as we round out the show with some very special formations and perhaps the finest Spitfire display that we have ever filmed. First up, 4 aircraft linked by their role defending Malta during the Second World War, 2 Spitfires, a Hurricane and a Gladiator. Initial defence of Malta was carried out exclusively by Gladiators, an extraordinary story still regarded with much admiration by the people of Malta. The Gladiator was the last biplane fighter to serve with the Royal Air Force. It was introduced to service in 1937, the same year as the Hawker Hurricane, and only 1 year ahead of the Spitfire, rendering it immediately obsolete as soon as it arrived. Nevertheless, it was down to a fleet of less than a dozen Gladiators to defend the island of Malta from Italian attack in 1940, and, incredibly, these ageing biplanes managed to stave off the larger Italian force for several weeks until the first Hurricanes arrived to provide reinforcement. The Gladiator was exported widely and ended up operating second or even third hand with many different air arms, including the Luftwaffe. There were even cases of Gladiators fighting each other, including one Gladiator-on-Gladiator kill, when a British example shot down an Iraqi one. Today there are only 2 airworthy Gladiators in the world. This example is based here as part of the Shuttleworth collection, and the other is based at Duxford. Hurricanes took responsibility for defending Malta for over a year, and during that time they took a hammering. By March 1942, less than 10% of Hurricanes dispatched to Malta remained operational. And so, in 1942, Spitfire XIVes like these began to arrive to provide reinforcement. Initially, that small Spitfire fleet was battered just as hard as the Hurricanes had been. They were particularly vulnerable while on the ground. But as Spitfire numbers grew, so did the overall potency of Allied air power. By the summer of 1942, the balance of power in Malta had finally swung in favour of the Royal Air Force for the first time, and the Axis powers abandoned their attempts to invade the island later that year. In this display we see Spitfire Mk./C EE602 from Fighter Aviation Engineering, and she flew in both British and Australian service. We also see the Shuttleworth Collection's own Spitfire Mk./C AR501. Neither of these Spitfires participated in operations in Malta, but they do share a very different history. The film Memphis Belle inaccurately depicts P-51 Mustangs as escort fighters when it was credited with becoming the first B-17 to complete a full tour of duty. But in reality it was Spitfires, not Mustangs, that escorted Memphis Belle, and to be specific, it was these Spitfires, among many others of course. Both of these very aircraft performed escort duties alongside that famed B-17. The Shuttleworth Collection is famous for its First World War aircraft. They operate several of them, and 3 took to the air at the Family Airshow. The Bristol M1C was the only British monoplane fighter to see service during the First World War. It was designed to produce minimal drag and thus achieve high speed, and in that regard it was a great success. The M1C could comfortably outrun most of its German contemporaries. Unfortunately, pilots and government officials doubted the safety of monoplanes, and so only 130 M1Cs were built. Just one original survives, it's on static display in Australia, but there's also one airworthy replica. It's this one, operated by the Shuttleworth Collection. The Sopwith triplane started out as a private project, broadly similar to the already successful Sopwith Pup, except with an extra wing. Having more wings meant that each individual wing could be narrower, thus giving the pilot better visibility. The triplane configuration also produced excellent handling. The first prototype flew in 1916, and just 3 minutes after taking off for that first flight, test pilot Harry Hawker began flying aerobatics, a ringing endorsement of his confidence in the design. In all, though, only 147 were built. It was outstandingly successful in combat, but notoriously difficult to maintain, and within a few months they were already being phased out and replaced by the Sopwith Camel. None survive in airworthy condition, but there are 2 flying replicas, of which this is one. With more than 5,000 built, the SE5A was by far the most numerous aircraft featured in this display. It was fast, light, stable and versatile, well liked by pilots and ground crews. Unlike the other aircraft, this is not a replica, but an original. In fact, it is the only original SE5A still flying anywhere in the world.
And many of the most famous Allied aces of the First World War.
The Shuttleworth collection is home to one aircraft of Soviet origin, a Polikarpov Po-2.
Came into being in 1929, it was known by a different designation, one that's perhaps more familiar to us in another rather different context, namely as the U-2.
Originally designated the U-2, it first flew in 1927 and went on to become the standard trainer of the Soviet Air Force. It was, to the Soviets, what the Tiger Moth was to the British. Later models, wartime and onwards, were generally referred to as Po-2s, and they were built in enormous numbers, well in excess of 20,000 aircraft. Their usage also expanded far beyond training, and they found utility as low-cost, virtually expendable light attack platforms, as well as conducting reconnaissance, liaison, and even medical evacuation missions.
The number of trainees being rejected for poor airmanship noticeably dropped.
"16 nations operated the Po-2, and they remained in military service into the 1960s. While a handful remain airworthy around the world, mostly in Russia and the former Soviet Union, this is the only one in Britain. The youngest of the Shuttleworth collection's many military trainers is the Provost T1, which first flew in 1950, designed to replace the Prentice in Royal Air Force service. They were generally well liked by pilots, carefree yet stable, and with a good amount of power. In British service, it was replaced fairly rapidly by a jet-powered derivative, the Jet Provost. Indeed, early Jet Provosts look visually quite similar to the piston-powered version, although the main production models deviated substantially from the original design.
Purpose was pretty useless. what's not in doubt is that this is a much more powerful, capable aeroplane and much better...
The Provost was relatively successful on the export market, receiving orders from 8 foreign air arms, but its production run was fairly modest, with fewer than 500 aircraft built.
Readily through the advanced stage to the jet stage on the de Havilland Vampire trainer that had been the case before.
If not for external factors, with the development of the early jet-powered trainers, then the Provost would probably have become much more numerous and much more famous than it did indeed become. Today, just 5 examples remain in an airworthy condition. There was an interesting 2-ship routine at the Family Airshow by 2 more of the Shuttleworth Collection's aircraft, their Lysander 3A and Anson C-19.
Designed for Avro, well, in the form of the Avro 19 Anson.
The Lysander was designed as a multi-role army support aircraft, capable of supporting troops on the ground by providing reconnaissance, artillery spotting and even close air support. Lysanders could be fitted with stub wings housing machine guns, and they were capable of carrying small bombs. Alternatively, they could be used to drop resupply canisters rather than bombs. Lysanders were also used for special operations, depositing and collecting British agents from occupied Europe, and that is what this aircraft represents. Special Operations Lysanders were unarmed, painted black for low conspicuity at night, and carried a long-range fuel tank underneath the fuselage. They were also fitted with a ladder to allow easy access to the rear cockpit, slightly reducing the amount of time the aircraft would spend on the ground while picking up agents behind enemy lines.
Following year, its vulnerability became clear.
The Lysander was well suited to this role. With automatic slats, slotted flaps and a variable incidence horizontal stabiliser, it could fly at less than 60 knots and handled easily at low airspeed. This made it possible to land the Lysander in relatively small, unprepared fields while recovering agents from enemy territory.
Most famously, their use in support of the Special Operations Executive brought the type its enduring legend.
Much like the Lysander, the Anson served in many roles as well, among them coastal patrol, training, transport and support. As a result of its adaptability and of its relatively long 17-year production run, the Anson is the most produced twin-engine British aircraft of all time, with nearly 11,000 being built. A large proportion of Second World War RAF bomber pilots will have trained on one. While there are numerous Ansons being restored around the world, only 3 are currently in an airworthy condition. This one, a C-19 communication and transport version, was built in 1946, and it only ever flew in civilian ownership. Nowadays, though, it's painted in the colours of an aircraft used post-war by the RAF Coningsby Station Flight. The Anson has been operated by the Shuttleworth collection for several years now, but until recently it was actually owned by BAE Systems. In 2022, BAE gifted this and 2 other vintage aircraft to the Shuttleworth collection for continued operation on the airshow circuit. The early years of general aviation are always well represented at Shuttleworth's airshows. The CLA-7 Swift is a single-seat sport aircraft that first flew in 1930. "45 of them were built, and 3 still fly today.
The De Soto family of aircraft didn't really go on to achieve huge sales success.
The De Soto was a British licence-built, improved version of a Dutch aircraft called the Koolhoven FK-41, and it first flew in 1930.
They ordered 19, and this De Soto 1 from the Shuttleworth collection is in the colours of National Flying Services, and you can see it has NFS written on the top. They were very good at publicity. They used one of them to fly.
41 De Sotos were built. Most of them were used for flight instruction and pleasure flights, but one was used for the Mk.Robertson air race from the UK to Australia, and another was used by the Finnish Air Force as an air ambulance. Just 3 De Sotos survive, only 2 are flyable, and of those, only this is a Mark I version of the aircraft.
Joyride operators, and they made some significant long-distance flights. And one of them was in that Mk.Robertson air race of 1934, which was won by the Comet, which is now sitting in front of them. But against that, it's quite a big climb into the cockpit to get in, and once you're in there, the visibility out isn't great.
This was one of de Havilland's first attempts at making a light aircraft for the private market. The DH-51 is a 3-seat touring aeroplane, and it first flew in 1924. Unfortunately, though, it never really came to market. Originally, the aircraft used surplus military engines and thus was unable to get airworthiness certification, and a later change to the ADC Air Disco engine increased fuel consumption and operating costs to the point that the DH-51 was no longer competitive. Only 3 DH-51s were ever built, and this is the sole survivor. In the late 1920s, de Havilland produced a scaled-down version of the DH-51 called the DH-60 Moth. This aircraft would have only 2 seats, and it was powered by an ADC Cirrus or de Havilland Gypsy 1 engine. These proved far more suitable than the Air Disco, and the DH-60 was able to be mass-produced as a result, with 1,500 examples being built. A DH-60 and its successor, the DH-82 Tiger Moth, took part in a barnstorming routine along with several other aircraft types. Formation passes by a trio of biplanes were interspersed by high-altitude aerobatics by a Chipmunk Mk.XII and solo flybys from a Miles Magister.
Meanwhile, high above us, Andy Chippy Monk enjoyed his lunch so much he wants to see it again. Carrying out some loops.
The DH-60X Moth here is particularly historically significant because it used to be the personal aircraft of Richard Shuttleworth, after whom the Shuttleworth collection is named.
The bunting fluttering beautifully in the breeze.
It's been based here at Old Warden since 1932, meaning that it's been based at a single airfield for longer than any other airworthy aircraft in the world.
Helped to show it up and warn other pilots that there was a student in the air.
Another interesting biplane in this display is the Parnell Elf, distinctive due to its V-shaped wing trusses. This configuration was intended to remove the need for flying wires, allowing the wings to be folded away so the aircraft could be towed behind a car.
But now we have to get them all back into some semblance of an order and get them to carry out that famed Olympic sport.
Unfortunately, it was a rather heavy configuration, which didn't do much good for the aircraft's performance or fuel consumption.
Number 2 is the Havilland 60 Moth. Number 3 is the Havilland Tiger Moth.
The Elf first flew in 1929, and only 3 were built. This is the only one still flying.
Scott also now coming in, lining up. So, Cos has got through both. Scott's now got through one wing low.
The second phase of this display brought all 5 aircraft together for flower bombing and limbo flying.
Scott's too high, he's not going to get it down in time to get through second. But Dave would be much better. And monoplane is much easier to thread through the limbo. Through, but over the second. Climbed a bit too high. Cobb, far too wide, far too long. He's after a Delta Hotel. Yes, this isn't actually a place. It's actually a direct hit. So Scott, again, also long. Then alongside that is the all-white de Havilland 60 Moth that was once owned and flown by Richard Shuttleworth. And today it's being flown for us by Scott Butler. So it's our little barnstorm.
More family entertainment coming up next, but this time from a visiting aerobatic team, the Global Stars. This is not a normal Global Stars display. Typically they perform as a 4-ship, and all 4 of their aircraft are painted in a smart red and white paint scheme. That's not so today because most of the team aircraft are abroad. The Global Stars have displayed all around the world, across Europe, the Middle East and Asia. This year they've spent quite some time in the Philippines, and now several of the aircraft are en route to Bahrain, so in lieu of their normal aircraft, the team is flying one of their standard Extra 330 SCs, a borrowed Extra 300 LC, and an Edge 540. This is a classic Global Stars manoeuvre, the looping 270. A conventional loop to start with, but then as they exit the loop, in defiance of expectation, the formation will twist towards the crowd for a belly-up pass. Chris Burkett, the right wingman, now flies barrel rolls around the rest of the formation. The left wingman is Chris Heems, formerly a very senior military pilot and test pilot. He's now one of the most prolific and experienced airshow performers in the world, flying for several different teams and operating all manner of different aircraft types.
Please wave, because the quality of the aerobatics you get is directly dependent on the amount of effort you put into waving and cheering for them.
Chris and the other Chris in from the left and right now for some opposition passes. The single-seat Extra 330 SC that we see here is the most advanced and successful aerobatic aircraft currently on the market. And flying with it, the twin-seater, a bit older, a bit heavier, but not quite so much power. To counteract all of that, it has a slightly larger wing, which if anything gives it slightly better turn performance than the single-seater. Mk.Vcs, the team leader, often flies in the slot position, but he's been flying as the team lead today. And as usual, he fills the solo slot also. Mark has been flying aerobatics and air shows for over 40 years, and he is a former British national aerobatic champion at the unlimited level.
Here comes Mark with his solo slot.
He's flying the Edge 540, an aircraft that remains most famous for its use in the defunct Red Bull Air Race, but as you can see here, it's a very capable aerobatic machine also.
Mark's going end over end. He's really well.
It's stressed to plus or minus 12 G, which is a little more than the Extra 330 can take. It has a roll rate of 420 degrees per second, but its headline characteristic is its ability to be able to turn hard and fast. Better turn performance than the Extra.
These maneuvers that Mark's taking part in right now push up to about 8 G in his plane, which is the equivalent to weighing 8 times his normal weight.
Like so many aerobatic teams, the Global Stars end their show with a heart.
Big waves! Told you it works, look! There's your heart and kiss through the middle just before it blows away.
Further formation aerobatics came from this locally based duo of Pitts biplanes. This pair to the untrained eye look like a fully fledged aerobatic team with their smart, matching paint schemes and fully aerobatic formation routine.
Another loop, really a good impression of the size difference between the two types of big special in this display when you see them in plan form like
But they only ever fly at 1 or 2 shows per year, and they never stray further afield than Old Warden.
So one going to the right, one going to the left.
These two aircraft are owned and flown by Stu Goldspink and the chief engineer of the Shuttleworth collection, Jean-Michel Munn.
As if they're going to loop. No, as they come in on the 45-degree down line, they both roll out. Coming into it.
Now in for a mirror pass. In the lead, a Pitts S1S, and it's followed by a twin-seat Pitts S02AE, although the second seat has been covered over and a single-seat canopy has been installed for this performance. To accommodate the extra seat, the Pitts S2 has a larger fuselage, and so to counteract the extra weight and drag, it also has had to be fitted with a bigger wing and a more powerful engine, which produces 200 horsepower. That's 20 horsepower more than the single-seater.
And still, as we can see, an absolutely brilliant display aeroplane coming in a bit closer to us now in tight formation. Lovely chance to admire the matching black and yellow.
A complete change of pace next with some gliders. The Elliott's primary Eon first flew in 1948, a post-war reproduction of the SG-38 Shuttleglider. It was supposed to be extremely cheap and extremely simple, and indeed it was. But one thing it couldn't do very well was gliding. It offered a glide ratio of only 8:1. A Cessna Skyhawk with the engine switched off glides better than that. Little wonder only 80 were built. The LF-107 Luniak also first flew in 1948, but it offered glide performance some 3 times better than that of the Eon primary. It's displayed here in fantastic style by Graham Saw, a tail slide and then a push into a 3/4 outside loop, followed by a flick roll. The Luniak was designed by the Czech company Letov. It was intended to offer a compromise between good glide performance and respectable aerobatic capability, and as you can see, it did exactly that. Here, more wonderful flick rolls, but this time in a 45-degree downline. The Luniak would probably have been produced in enormous quantities had geopolitics not intervened, but the start of the Cold War cut off access to western parts, and Letov's factory was instead used to make jet fighters, meaning that only 75 Luniaks were ever built. The largest participant at the show, and the final Second World War participant, was the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight's Lancaster B-1.
Memorial Flight's Lancaster. And we say it's a motto, lest we forget.
The Lancaster tends not to perform full displays at Shuttleworth, but rather performs flypasts. This allows a customised routine of 3 passes sculpted to fit Old Warden's unique curved display line. This has been a terrible year for the BBMF. In May, they experienced a rare fatal accident which claimed the life of their incoming officer commanding, Squadron Leader Mark Long. After the accident, the squadron was grounded for 2 months. Indeed, their fighters still are grounded, but the Lancaster was recently allowed to return to the air, and this was its first weekend of air shows of the year. A racing theme encompassed much of the final part of the show, featuring 3 vintage racer types that all flew for the first time in 1934. Here's the first of them, David Beale's Mk.I. The first prototype Mk.I was a short, stubby aircraft with only 165 horsepower at its disposal, and this aeroplane is barely recognisable in comparison. Its rear fuselage has been stretched massively, and it's been fitted with a 205 horsepower Gypsy Queen engine. Five Mk.Is were built, of which one original survives today. It's in an airworthy condition and it's based here at the Shuttleworth collection, but it's not flying at the moment as it's undergoing an inspection.
Materials and components, such as the structure made from ash, spruce and ply with aluminium engine cowlings and wheel spats. He managed to obtain...
This one is a replica, but an extremely faithful replica. It depicts the personal aircraft flown by Edgar Percival, the aircraft which won the King's Cup air race twice. The original was destroyed in a German bombing raid in 1940. Next, the Hawk Speed 6. It was a single-seat racer version of the Miles M2 Hawk, a low-cost touring and training aeroplane.
He rose won the Manx Air Derby at Ronaldsway in this Hawk Speed 6.
While the standard Hawk was fitted with a 95 horsepower Cirrus 3A engine, the Speed 6 version had a 200 horsepower Gypsy engine. It also had a single-seat enclosed cockpit rather than a 2-place open cockpit to improve the aircraft's aerodynamic efficiency.
Malta.
3 Hawk Speed 6 aircraft were built, and this is the sole survivor. It was constructed in 1935 for the British-Brazilian racing driver Luis Fontes, who had ambitions of competing in that year's King's Cup air race.
The big handicap air races like the King's Cup.
While the aircraft failed to make the race that year, it did compete between 1936 and 1938, with mixed success.
Prestigious King's Cup, but he never managed to win it outright.
Perhaps the crowning jewel of the Shuttleworth Collection's fleet is their de Havilland Comet, and at the Family Airshow it performed a very special formation with the Royal Norwegian Air Force Historical Squadron's Vampire FB6.
Together, DH-88 Comet leads the DH-100 Vampire Mk.//.
This was the first time that these two de Havilland legends, Comet and Vampire, have flown together.
A lot of experience of wooden aircraft, perhaps most famously from the Mosquito.
Providing a brief break from the racing theme, we then saw a solo display from the Vampire. Like the Comet, the Vampire set several aviation records. It set airspeed and altitude records, became the first jet-powered aircraft to cross the Atlantic, and was also the first purely jet-powered aeroplane to take off and land from an aircraft carrier.
Which were day fighters only, but too late to see wartime service, they achieved a whole host of very notable feats.
Although it first flew in 1943, the Vampire entered military service too late to see combat in the Second World War. Their military service began in 1946, initially as interceptor fighters due to their high speed compared to piston-engined aeroplanes. The Royal Norwegian Air Force Historic Flight operate 2 Vampires, a T-55 trainer and this FB6 fighter bomber, one of just 2 single-seat Vampires flying in Europe.
And in the summer of 1948, number 54 Squadron RAF's Vampires became the first...
For the first half of the season, the FB6 was painted in the colours of the Royal Canadian Air Force to mark that air arm's centenary. The Vampire was one of the first jet-powered aircraft to be used in Canadian military service. Now, though, it's painted in the colours of the Royal Auxiliary Air Force, which is also marking its 100th anniversary this year.
And perhaps most effectively as a trainer. And 31 nations use Vampires of one sort or another, including Norway as the Royal Norwegian Air Force's first jet aircraft, and that's why the Norwegian Air Force Historical Squadron, from which this aircraft comes, has 2 of them in its fleet. They're both actually ex-Swiss Vampires. has two of them in its fleet. They're both actually ex-Swiss vampires.
Then came the Comet's display, flown in impeccable style by Jean-Michel Munn.
As the Comet goes through its paces, we're about to get this stunning Spitfire XIV into the air.
The Comet was a bespoke racing aircraft designed specifically to compete in the McRobinson Air Race from the UK to Australia. Three Comets were built for the race, and one of them, Golf Alpha Charlie Sierra Sierra, went on to win the competition, completing the race in 70 hours and 54 minutes. That is the very same aircraft that we see flying here today.
The Grosvenor House Hotel in London achieved just that. Unlike the other two Comets in the race,
In 1938, this aircraft was very nearly used for another mission, an even more historic one than its run to Australia.
it's first across the finishing line at Flemington Racecourse, the home of the Melbourne Cup.
An unidentified organisation contacted Comet test pilot Arthur Edmund Clouston with a proposal to use the Comet to bomb Adolf Hitler as he attended a military parade in Berlin. The Comet's exceptional range would allow it to fly first towards the Baltics, entering and departing German airspace from the northeast, and the aircraft would be disguised, making it difficult to recognise. Colston ultimately declined to help with the mission, feeling that the risks were too high.
It achieved that victory in the course of 70 hours, 54 minutes and 18 seconds, of which it was airborne for in excess of 65 hours, 24 minutes. Compare that with a typical commercial airline flight today, including a stopover in the Middle East or Far East between London and Melbourne.
The Comet was one of the highest performance aircraft of its era, and although just 5 were built, they were used extensively for air racing and for test and evaluation purposes by the governments of Britain, France and Portugal. 2 of those Comets survive today, and this is the only one in flying condition. The Comet participated in not one, but 2 special formations at the Family Airshow. After flying with the Vampire, it then teamed up with aerial speed icon Spitfire FR.XIVe. Then commenced one of the finest warbird displays that we have ever filmed. A Mark XIV Spitfire in simply glorious skies at one of the most intimate airshow venues in the world, and in the hands of John Romain, one of the finest warbird display pilots of our times. This wasn't flying, this was art. A striking paint scheme on this aircraft, depicting a Royal Air Force Spitfire 21 that was sent to participate in the Blackpool Air Pageant in 1947. But actually, this aeroplane was built in 1945. It served with the Royal Air Force and then with the Belgian Air Force before spending nearly 40 years on display as a gate guardian at Beauvechain Air Base. It was then brought back to the UK for restoration to flight and took to the air again in 2002. The pilot then, as now, was John Romain. After a spell in the United States, she returned to the UK in 2020 but has only appeared at a small handful of airshows ever since then. She's currently owned by Aerial Speed Icons but operated by the Aircraft Restoration Company. This display was quite simply indescribable. Man and machine flying as one, a spectacle for which there are simply not enough superlatives in the English language. Warbird aerobatic displays don't get any better than this. There really is no finer way to end our look back at the Shuttleworth Family Airshow 2024, and what an enjoyable day it was. A magical venue, superbly choreographed intimate flying displays, and brilliant weather to boot. Next time, more warbirds as we head to France for this year's edition of Air Legend. But until then, thank you very much for your company. It's goodbye for now.